What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Moon Knight, episode 2. God, there were a ton of different Easter eggs over the course of this episode, so we're going to cover a bunch of them, although there may be a few that we have missed here and there. The first thing I want to do here is I want to talk about an Easter egg that I personally didn't find, but that a lot of people are referencing, but they're only referencing a small portion of it, right? You got to reference the whole thing. So there's a scene in the show, which, by the way, spoilers. I don't know anybody who would watch this and wouldn't expect spoilers. There is a point when Mark goes to, I guess, Steve Grant, that persona, goes to find his storage unit that belongs to Marc Spector, and the storage unit is numbered 43. A lot of people are saying this is a reference to Moon Knight Volume 1, issue number 43, which was released in 1992. And people are saying that's kind of an Easter egg because it's a reference to the Eternals and Dane Whitman, who is played by Kit Harington, that kind of a thing. It's a lot bigger than that. So here's the thing. Moon Knight Volume 1, issue number 43, when it was released in 1992, was part of a story which has the same name as a movie that the Marvel Cinematic Universe recently made, and probably one of the biggest movies the MCU recently made, which is Infinity War. So Infinity War in 1992, of course, was a follow-up to Infinity Gauntlet. Totally different story, but in effect, what had happened is an evil alter ego, or I guess the evil version of Adam Warlock known as the Magus, got his hands on what he thought was the Infinity Gauntlet, only to find out that Thanos tricked him when he gave him a fake reality stone. But the thing about this is that there was a point in that story where, in order to keep the heroes distracted, I guess, decent enough reason, basically the Magus created a bunch of doppelgangers of heroes that we know. And of course, that basically led to Moon Knight teaming up with like US Agent and teaming up with Dane Whitman and like the X-Men and a bunch of different characters in order to face off against those doppelgangers. So whether or not this is an actual reference to the events, or at least to the Eternals themselves, I don't necessarily know. Maybe, but it is a cool little Easter egg to have in there. Having said that, let's get into the stuff that we found. Okay, so one, Marc Spector kind of gets an origin, but not really, right? So the origin that's really given to us is by the two detectives that basically arrest him, which we'll talk about them here in a second because they're characters from the comics. And what they really say here is that essentially Mark and his ilk, right, when he was part of a mercenary team, ended up basically killing the archaeologist and then shooting him in the back of the head, right? They literally tied him down, shot him in the back of the head, and that was it. Now, that's only one part of the story. In the comics, the whole context of the story is that basically the architect and what was his daughter, or supposed to be his daughter at the time, Marlene Alruane, and then in turn Marc Spector, were basically attacked and left for dead by Raoul Bushman. Raoul Bushman, of course, being the kind of head guy that was essentially running the show outside of the archaeologist. We don't know if Raoul Bushman exists in the show. Maybe he does. I haven't seen anything to indicate that he does. Maybe I missed his name in the credits or something like that. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But the origin story as it's given to us in this episode is only one part of the equation. I imagine as time goes on, we'll get the full origin of Marc Spector. Maybe. It doesn't seem like it's super important to the nature of Mark, given everything else that's going on. It seems like what's happening in the present is way more important than what happened in the past. But there are a lot of unleft answers in terms of like what were the terms of the deal that were struck between like Marc Spector and Khonshu, outside of the fact that Marc Spector would be his agent on Earth. So indirectly and directly to a degree, a lot of the questions that we would have insofar as like how did Marc Spector come under the service of Khonshu and so on and so forth, a lot of those really seem to have been answered. So we may not get that full origin. That's something to kind of prepare yourself for, because again, at this point, it doesn't seem absolutely necessary. Having said that, let's move on to Arthur Harrow. Now, this is a huge thing. This is a totally different thing because Arthur Harrow does a couple different things here. One, he references the idea that Marc Spector, or Steve Grant, when he's talking to Steve, says that like he was chosen as the avatar of Khonshu because his mind was broken, or at least kind of asked the question, is that the reason why? This is a direct reference to Jeff Lemire's Moon Knight run, where in that story, Khonshu readily admits to like Moon Knight, Marc Spector, Steve Grant, whatever you want to call him, that he did choose him because his mind was broken, and they manipulate him. Now, the other part of this, in terms of Jeff Lemire's run, and the reason why it was so important, is because what you ended up learning is that the goal of Khonshu here is to quite literally, quote unquote, unquote hollow out the vessel or the avatar that he has chosen, so that in turn, at a future point in time, Khonshu can basically possess them and then re-enter into the mortal world. Of course, Moon Knight basically stands in the way of that, but it's a cool little Easter egg here, right? Literally referencing Jeff Lemire's run, which, as I understand it, was a massive influence on this show, and you can feel it. If you ever read Jeff Lemire's Moon Knight run, you can definitely see where there are huge influences here. Now, the other thing about this that's really interesting is that Arthur says that he was previously a Fist of Khonshu. This is a totally new development for the show. This did not exist in the comics. In the comics, Arthur Harrow was just an asshole who was obsessed with pain. That's all he was, right? Like, he was like one of the first, or kind of a significant villain to a degree, that Moon Knight fought relatively early on in his career, and that was basically it. There wasn't really anything other than that to this guy. So the Marvel Cinematic Universe is drastically changing the role of Arthur Harrow in the MCU, which kind of seems to be an ongoing thing. While the Netflix series never quite got a chance to finish it, Danny Rand was basically the most recent Iron Fist, and you actually ended up learning that there were other Iron Fists that came before him. We never got to see how far reaching that went, because they ended up dropping the series after season 1, which coincided with the fact that 1, that first season was garbage, and 2, because of the fact that basically the whole deal with Disney and Netflix came to an end and the characters went back. So fingers crossed, Disney redoes Iron Fist and actually makes it good. Now, the next thing that goes on here, I'm sorry, I had to take pot shots. I had to take pot shots here. The other thing that goes on here is we're introduced to Layla. Layla, of course, being the wife of Marc Spector. Now, this is interesting here, because when I initially saw the character of Layla in episode 1, when like her number appeared a zillion times, we, for the most part, suspected that she was probably Marlene from the comics, basically the wife, or would eventually become the wife of Marc Spector, and then eventually they would divorce. But we largely suspected that was the case. We didn't know for sure. This episode solidifies that, and thank God, because my biggest fear in the beginning, in the first episode, was Layla Miller. And I was like, I really hope not, because she sucks. She serves no useful purpose in the comics. For those of you guys who don't know who Layla Miller is, Layla Miller was a character that was created by Brian Michael Bendis when he wrote House of M, and was literally a way for him to just give himself away out of the story, right? Like, this girl was just a girl who knows things, and like, things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And like, she knows how things are supposed to be. Like, she's a walking, talking plot device. That's literally all she is. Are you a Marvel Comics writer? Have you written yourself into a hole? Do you not know how to get yourself out of the corner that you've created and this phenomenal story that you've written? Well, let me introduce you to Layla Miller. The 100% guaranteed way to get out of a hole. Like, she's 100% useless. So thank God she's not here. In all reality, Layla is, by all standards of measurement, Marlene, just by a different name. Now, how much of her history will contribute to Marlene, we're not 100% sure. It could be that she really is the daughter of the archaeologist. His name escapes me. But like, you know, it could be that she's the daughter of that guy, and like Marc Spector was there, and so on and so forth. It could be they have a more intense history together. It seems like it does, right? Because a lot of her history, as far as Layla's concerned, in the little bit of an explanation we got, is very similar to Marlene, in the sense that like Marlene and Marc Spector went on a whole bunch of adventures and did a whole bunch of different things together, you know, after they had fallen in love and become a power couple, and so on and so forth. So I'm curious to see how far this is going to go. Now, one of the other things I also want to point out is the portal that Arthur Harrow opens is actually a portal that leads to a place called the Duat, I think is how you pronounce it, but it's basically the realm of the dead in the Egyptian mythos. And so in effect, that's where the jackals and those things come from, which seems to be that they focus, that's really the realm of like Anubis. And that's kind of interesting in that way. But regardless, that's that little Easter egg reference thing. Essentially, he's just harnessing the power of Ammit. So again, I guess maybe not necessarily an Easter egg, more so just kind of like, this is what he's doing in the show. But another really cool little Easter egg is in the fight between Mr. Knight, who we'll talk about here in a second, which I know a lot of you guys are probably wondering about him. In the fight between Mr. Knight and the Jackal, which nobody but Mr. Knight can see, there's a point where he gets knocked into one of those red British buses, which I've always wanted to ride and never had a chance to. They just look cool. And there's an ad there for the Global Repatriation Council. Now, for those of you guys who watched Falcon and the Winter Soldier, you know that GRC is the organization that was introduced, which is basically reintegrating people back into society after they were were blinked out of existence during the Thanos snap and then brought back by the Incredible Hulk. They also seem kind of shady. But the thing about this is like, it's a reference to them, which is cool. It's cool to see the small little tidbits of things that have been established in the MCU being referenced in other shows. Now, I don't necessarily consider this next one to be an absolute Easter egg, really more of just personal interpretation, but the rooftop scene where the Jackal is chasing the actual Marc Spector, the actual Moon Knight, the proper Moon Knight, after Marc Spector takes over in terms of like being the prime personality, that is a reference to the old Werewolf by Night appearance, right? When Moon Knight first appeared and fought Werewolf by Night. There's a couple reasons why I say that. One, because that rooftop scene is kind of iconic, and two, because the Jackal literally looks like a werewolf. It really, really does. It's probably not Jack Russell, who is the identity of Werewolf by Night, like we saw it crawl out of the ground. So unless Jack Russell had just been hanging out in the realm of the dead under the service of Amit, it's not him. But it is a cool little reference, and I am excited to see where that leads us to in the future of the Moon Knight episodes. But the next two things, the two detectives who arrested Marc Spector, those are in reference to Bobby and Billy from Jeff Lemire's Moon Knight run. And instead of them being detectives in the Moon Knight run, they're actually orderlies working at the mental institution that are designed to basically keep Marc Spector imprisoned there. So again, it's not a huge shift, not a great big huge change, but still a cool small little thing nonetheless, right? Just a cool little reference to the influence that Jeff Lemire's run had on the Moon Knight show. And that leads us to probably the biggest thing in the Moon Knight episode, which is Mr. Knight. Now here's the thing, yes, Mr. Knight does look every bit as awesome in the comics as he does in the show. And yes, when Mr. Knight first appeared, when he was first created by Warren Ellis in his Moon Knight run, everybody was dressed as him at Comic-Cons everywhere. And that's probably gonna be an even higher number now because Mr. Knight just looks cool. So what's the deal with Mr. Knight and how does he differentiate from Moon Knight? The best way to think about this is the relationship between Moon Knight and Mr. Knight almost mirrors the relationship between Marc Spector and Steve Grant. Jake Lockley, of course, we've talked about before. He's the cab driver persona, the guy that keeps his ear to the ground, doesn't ever really want to be noticed. But where Marc Spector is like the mercenary, the hardcore Moon Knight, kills people whenever he has to kind of thing, Steve Grant is more of like the wealthy, kind of up there to do, keeping his eye and keeping his ear on like white collar crime, different things like that, and using the money that comes from Grant Industries to basically fund the Moon Knight-esque events, right? Allow him to basically operate. The relationship between Moon Knight and Mr. Knight is very similar to that, where Moon Knight is like the vigilante running around in the middle of the night, beating people up, usually killing them. Mr. Knight is more of like the publicly acceptable front face of that, right? He's a wholly different personality. It's not Moon Knight dressed up in a different outfit. He's a wholly different guy, a whole different personality, but he's very Sherlock Holmes-esque in terms of how he works. He's got a relationship with police officers, different things along those lines. So he's kind of he's like Batman, but like more socially acceptable and cooler, to be honest. That's kind of his thing. Right now in Marvel Comics, in fact, with Jed McKay's run on Moon Knight, it is focusing on Mr. Knight, with basically like the Midnight Mission, that kind of a thing. But make no mistake, right? Mr. Knight still like protects the vulnerable and the weak and that kind of a thing. He's just not necessarily as extreme and violent as Moon Knight is. That's why if you go and you read the Moon Knight comics right now by Jed McKay, it's Mr. Knight who like listens to people's problems. When they come to him, they say, this is a thing that I'm struggling with, but like when he leaps into action and starts f***ing people up, he's Moon Knight. So that's basically what's going on, you know, with regards to those two personalities. I am excited to see it. The biggest thing here, though, is that it doesn't really look like Mr. Knight in the Moon Knight show matches Mr. Knight from the comics. It really looks more like Mr. Knight is just the Steve Grant version of Moon Knight, is all it is, right? The polite Moon Knight. He's gonna beat the crap out of you, but in the nicest way, you know, like, you look great with blood on your shirt, right? That gash across your forehead really brings out the color of your eyes. You know, that's the kind of thing that you would expect, you know, from Mr. Knight. Again, more of a very kind of mild-mannered Moon Knight to a degree. So I don't really know if we're going to see him again. I really hope we do, and I really hope they kind of build him up. Again, there's not a ton of episodes here. If we had like 12 or 13 episodes to work with, sure. But as far as I'm aware, I think we're we're limited to 6, which is kind of the status quo with Disney Plus Marvel shows now. So I am curious to see where they go with it. But nonetheless, guys, let's talk about the ending, right? The ending of the show with basically Mark, Steve, whoever, waking up in what looks like a really cool hotel in Egypt, right? We obviously know this is going to lead more into like the Egyptian mythos. What I'm really hoping this does is it delves more into like the various gods that exist out there in the events of like the Moon Knight mythos. Because one of the things that I hope you guys are noticing here is that with Thor Love and Thunder coming out, that one focusing on Gore the God Butcher, and the idea that Gore is basically a being who travels around the universe, at least in the comics anyway, and kills all the different gods that he can find. Right now, we're in the Age of Gods when it comes to the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The only exception to that potentially being Doctor Strange 2. But even then, we're not entirely sure, although rumors abound, especially given the current Dreams trailer, that Nightmare is the person who's involved, that it would make sense that we're dealing more with like gods and cosmic beings than we are anything else. So Moon Knight fits in perfectly with that. And so now would be a great opportunity to introduce like a lot of these other gods that exist out there. And while we wouldn't necessarily get into like the Hindu god Vishnu or anything like that, the fact that Bast originally started as an Egyptian god and then eventually became the Wakandan god and really the Wakandan patron saint of the Black Panther clan, it would be cool to have a reference there, right? To have something where they're just like, yeah, and then Bast over there who hangs out with the Wakandans, she started here, bro. She used to sit at the cool kids table and now she's at like the super cool kids table, so she's too good for us now, apparently, right? Brings her own lunch and everything. I mean, it'd be cool if they did that, right? Which would be a really interesting concept. I don't know if they will. I would really like it if they did, because I feel like it would just really tie together the MCU in a way that kind of hasn't been done, right? Because the only real things that we've seen that have kind of unified the Marvel Cinematic Universe have been like the Avengers teaming up. And like, that's kind of it, right? And like, Blade's voice in the background at the end of the Eternals in the post-credit scene. Like, that's really all we have, right? But basically saying that, like, Bast was once an Egyptian god and is, like, the sister and or brother, because gods don't really have a gender, but, like, the sister and or brother of, like, Khonshu, it'd be a great way to kind of unify things and to really bring back this idea that, like, it is all a shared universe, right? Because I don't know about you guys, but, like, the shows are cool, the movies are cool, but it kind of feels like things are just sort of moving off into their own direction, and everything kind of feels isolated to a degree. I don't know if I'm the only one feeling that. Let me know if you guys are, but I'm kind of feeling that here. So I really feel like referencing Bast as like the Panther god that now resides or looks over the Wakandans, but originally started out as an Egyptian god, would be a great way to kind of bring that unification back into play again. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.